Those are the sounds of the music of Xavier Quijas Yaxotl, an Aztec classical musician in Mexico whose work has revived the use of Aztec era rattles, flutes, trumpets made from shells, and other traditional instruments. Aztec music was an important part of upper class households and, in some ways, symbolizes the complex divisions of wealth and status and power in Aztec society. These divisions, this a kind of complexity and a cultural output, is what Europeans often associate with the notion of civilization. The idea of civilization is a European concept derived from earlier notions of civil society or civitas, which is the idea of a body of citizens. But the term civilization itself is introduced in the French and English languages 100 years or so after European American contact. And the idea is loaded with colonial connotations, including the idea that Europeans are civilized and that other places in the world are not, and in need of European civilization. And so you can see how this concept becomes justification for colonial invasions. Civilization is a concept that connotes the idea of advanced societies, urban culture, complex social structures and divisions, and rich cultural output. Of course, this is something that characterizes the societies of the Americas prior to the arrival of Europeans. It is characteristic of many societies in sub Saharan Africa, many societies in the Islamic world, and of course in China and other places in East Asia. But Europeans do not always recognize these features as civilization. Or they debate about them, and they debate the meanings of whether or not these countries are civilized. One of the things you'll learn in your reading over the next week or so is that when the Spanish arrived in the Western Hemisphere, there were people who thought that Spanish violence against Native Americans was totally justified, and there were others, including a man named Bartolome de las Casas, who will figure much more prominently in later lectures this week, who argued that many aspects of Native American society rival European society in terms of technological advancement, and many of the features associated with civilization. And he noted the astronomical and mathematical observations of the Maya and the Aztec, which in some cases were as advanced and in some cases even more advanced than a European knowledge of mathematics and astronomy of the time. He also points to their densely populated urban centers. And so, when we look at this debate that Europeans are having about whether or not these other regions of the world are civilized or not, it's important to note that Europeans are not a monolith. And to some extent, I raise this because I would like to suggest that maybe Europeans do know what they are doing when they are going into the colonial world. And they know what they are doing when they are inventing new categories of people that allow them to enslave and, kind of force people to do their will based on this idea of race. And of course, by the 17th and 18th centuries, civilization is an idea that kind of morphs into ideas about race, which is this idea of fixed biological features. So instead of civilization being a descriptor for cultural differences, it becomes this descriptor for biological capacity. Europeans supposedly have a greater capacity for civilization. Other races of people, and again, race is a very European concept. Other races of people do not have this capability and therefore are in need of the civilizing influence of a European economy or politics or their religion, which is Christianity. By the 1300s and 1400s, Europeans assumed that lack of cities or a complex social structure indicated a lack of technology or Christianity. In the 1700s and the 1800s, it's really this idea of race. So I'll say this a couple of different times just because it's an important evolution that I want you to pay attention to. And of course, contradicting this myth is the evidence that Europeans in late medieval and early modern society, which is about 1200 to 1500 in the current era, these Europeans lived in relatively small cities that were dwarfed by the resources and complexity of cities in the Islamic world, in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in China, and also in the Americas. European wealth and technology and urban concentration lags significantly behind places like Fez, Timbuktu, Mali, Baghdad, Samarkand, Delhi, Beijing. These are just a few of the cities that are larger than any other comparable European city at the time, which is Paris, right? That is the largest and most complex European urban society at the time of American-European contact between 1492 and 1500. So when Europeans stumbled into the New World, the largest city in the Old World at the time was Beijing. But by the 15 teens, adventurers and conquistadors acting on behalf of Spain began to stumble into the densely urban, densely populated urban areas of central Mexico. And eventually they would set their sights on Tenochtitlan, which demographic historians sometimes estimate was in fact the largest city in the world at the time. It's been suggested that anywhere from 200 to 400,000 people lived in Tenochtitlan alone, and that excludes some of the smaller suburbs and surrounding villages in nearby urban centers. And there are other cities around the lake where Tenochtitlan is constructed, and that's Lake Texcoco. That's the other thing that's kind of unusual about Tenochtitlan. And by the way, that's what you're looking at. That's the image that you're looking at. It was built on a lake. It was built using materials gathered from the local marsh. And so it's a rather incredible feat of civil engineering. At any rate, the population of Tenochtitlan would not stand for very long because in the 1520s, disease and warfare sweeps through the area and it just absolutely decimates the city. And eventually Tenochtitlan is reconstructed as Mexico City, which is one of the longest continuously occupied places in the entire world. Tenochtitlan, in fact, is not the only urban center or even the most important urban center in pre-Columbian history. If you were to kind of rewind the clock to 1400 or 1300, and somehow Europeans were to arrive then, they would see a very different society, especially in North America. In North America, there are a number of urban centers that are organized around mounds, these large earthen pyramids that are some of the largest largest earthworks in human history. These mounds seem to have some connection to the pyramids in Central America and Mexico. And I'll talk about those in a minute because they're actually much, much older. These mounds are organized around intensely agricultural societies that grow mostly maize or corn. That's what we call corn. But also beans and squash and other crops. If you look at this region on the map of the eastern half of North America, agricultural historians have sometimes described this area as an extensive garden. Sometimes Native Americans engaged in what Europeans would recognize as agriculture, where there are sown fields and there is devoted cropland. But a lot of this is what contemporary agriculturalists refer to as permaculture, almost like a garden, right? And Native Americans cultivated and bred a number of vegetable crops that we use today. I think something like 60% of food crops that are grown in the world today are in some ways created from Native American cultivars. So tomatoes, potatoes, most berries, all of that stuff is selected and grown very carefully over many millennia by Native Americans. The largest urban center in this North American zone, or what is sometimes referred to as Mississippian culture, because these sites are concentrated around the Mississippi River, is an area in present day Louisiana called Poverty Point. And there's another very large city near present day St. Louis called Cahokia, which is probably a little bit more famous. Because the pyramid is much more visible. You can see it you can actually see it from outer space. You can see it from the highway when you drive by. There has been a lot of archaeological excavation. And there's another site in the Appalachian foothills called Etowah, that's in Georgia. So these regions had a similar culture. They had similar religious iconography. They worshipped a deity that was symbolized by a bird or a birdman, which seems also to have some connection to central Mexico and Central America. Goods in Mississippian cultures are from all over the Americas, which suggests that Native Americans had formed an extensive trading network prior to the arrival of Europeans. Goods from South America are found in some of these North American sites. Caribbean goods are sometimes found in these North American sites, jade goods from central Mexico. So we know that there's a lot of interaction between and among different Native American nations at this time. Most of those settlements, by the time Europeans arrive, will have been deserted. And that's because it's called the Little Ice Age. There is a period of climatic cooling in the 1300s, 1400s, and 1500s that leads to drier conditions in North America, and this starves a lot of Native American agriculture of much needed water. So a lot of those densely populated cities will disperse, and a lot of these urban societies kind of collapse. So another place where this occurs much more dramatically is in the present-day southwest of the United States. This is an area where there's also maize farming, also beans and squash, but farming or agriculture is a little less extensive because the conditions are much more desert-like. That said, prior to 1300, 1400, this region experienced several centuries of high rainfall. And so these are pretty productive croplands for a long period of time. There's mining, there's agriculture, and there's textile manufacturing and earthenwork manufacturing. And there's also extensive trade between this region and central Mexico. And in fact, the Aztec, the Mexica as they are also known, had come from this region, which they sometimes located in their legend with the land of Aztlan, which is sometimes associated with present-day Arizona or New Mexico. At any rate, these societies had also collapsed in the 1400s and 1500s because of the Little Ice Age, but their settlements were more permanent. The Mississippian culture built settlements out of thatch and wood, and so we don't have as much evidence of that. The cultures in the Southwest built cities from stone, and they, built houses and roads and crop structures that were able to support fairly large urban populations in the deserts and caverns of New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado. The most famous of these sites is Mesa Verde, which, Google the image of that because it's extensive. It's this beautiful, elaborate site, this city kind of nestled in the hills. By 1400 or 1500, though, it's, again, it's abandoned. So when Europeans show up in the 1500s and the 1600s, they notice some of these features, but they largely dismiss them because they're not associated with these large populations. They actually don't really note the pyramids in Mississippian culture, the large earth pyramids. they simply think that they are mountains. And it takes Europeans a little while to figure out that mountains are actually not very common in in some of these regions because they're built in plains, and so they start to pay attention to actually how they were constructed. Native Americans, incidentally know and still remember and maintain these sites as sacred sites, but not necessarily as urban centers. So even today, the Cahokia site is home to a number of spiritual and religious and cultural activities of Shawnee Native Americans who are indigenous to the region. So moving into Mexico, there's a third region, which is the wealthiest and the oldest, historically oldest culture in the Americas. This is the maize farming culture associated with present-day central Mexico. This culture gets established around 2500 BCE, before the Common Era. So it's right around the time the pyramids in Egypt are being built, and Egyptian society is kind of at its zenith. This society in central Mexico is called the Olmec Society. Maize has been around for a while, but the Olmecs are a very good agriculturalists, and so they are able to establish fairly rich maize agriculture in the region, and their influence kind of spreads from there. The Olmecs are extremely influential in terms of language and culture, their interest in astronomical observations and mathematics. And to some extent, almost all of the different cultures in the region are descended at some point from this original Olmec culture. The Olmecs built many of the cities and many of the settlements of central Mexico that would later be occupied by the Aztec Empire. So one of the other major cities that's sort of built in this time is the city of Teotihuacan, which has some of the largest pyramids in the world. And Teotihuacan was mostly abandoned by the time the Spanish arrived, but there was still a sizable population there, but it had declined quite a bit from its initial height. So at any rate, the history of the Aztecs is a little more recent. The oral history of the Aztecs has it that the Mexica migrated from a northern region in the 1300s, and they established their capital at Tenochtitlan, where they were ruled by a series of kings. And the Aztecs had a contested relationship with neighboring societies. The Aztecs practiced a religion that required lots of human sacrifice, not just one or two a year kind of thing, but lots and lots of killing. And incidentally, that's something else that leads us to believe there are connections between the Mississippian cultures and central Mexico cultures. These sacrifices associated with astronomical events like the solstice, associated with pyramids, are found throughout North America, Mexico, and Central America. So it leads us to believe that there are cultural links between these groups. Human sacrifice varied from society to society. There were some where it was not as extensively practiced as others, but it does seem like the Aztecs were the most proficient practitioners. And so as a result, they created a lot of enmity between themselves and surrounding Native American groups. It's something to think about when you read about Native Americans allying themselves with the Spanish to attack the Aztecs. This is really important. Native Americans did not see themselves as part of the same race or the same culture or the same religion or the same group. They saw themselves as members of their own ethnic groups, their own communities, their own urban centers, and Europeans were just outsiders. And so there's not this sense that it's, us against them. So Europeans, on the other hand, tend to see Native Americans as all the same, but they know that they have divisions among them, and the Spanish and other Europeans will exploit these divisions in order to gain the upper hand. So in a lot of cases, when we talk about Native American genocide, we are talking about a really complex process. On the one hand, it involves exactly what we think of when we think of genocide. which is the attack of a group of people and their systematic killing. And the Spanish certainly, and other European powers, certainly participated in their share of direct genocide. But in a lot of cases, they took advantage of divisions and created civil wars that accomplished that genocide for them. And of course, the Spanish are not, they don't know what they are doing, but they are also spreading around diseases like smallpox, which decimate Native American communities. Although, again, they're not really quite aware of germ theory or how any of that stuff works. They know that they are responsible for bringing these diseases, but there's not really a recognition of the complex biological processes behind all of that. Native Americans, in the same way, don't really understand the biological processes behind these new diseases, but they definitely know they are being brought by Europeans. So, at any rate, some of these cities in central Mexico include Tenochtitlan, the massive city of Teotihuacan, and the city of Tula. These are all relatively close together. These are just a few of the hundreds, literally hundreds of cities of this region. Further south is another society that is kind of descended from Olmec society, and this is the Maya society. Mayan society was, the society that we have the most information about because they had a written language, they had books, they had extensive libraries, and they were the culture that was the most interested in the mathematical implications of some of these astronomical observations. So they had the number zero, which is a super, I don't really know that much about the history of math and science, but it is a super complex concept that is introduced very late in European history. And so, the Aztecs kind of came up with this on their own. They were able to calculate the circumference of the Earth. They knew the Earth was round. So all of these things suggest that these societies, again, are just as sophisticated as European societies, even if they don't always have exactly the same technology or the same knowledge. And they developed all of this knowledge and technology independently. So Central American cities, Mayan cities, are not quite as militaristic as cities in central Mexico. Teotihuacan and Tenochtitlan are both centers of these military empires. It seems like Maya societies are loosely affiliated with one another. The analogy is sometimes that they are like Greek city-states. So they kind of speak the same language, they practice the same religion, but they are not necessarily part of the same political entity. So this group kind of escapes the worst of Spanish genocide because they are sort of able to hide out in the jungles and marshes of the Yucatan. They're able to hide some of their sacred books. Although that said, there's a massive scale of destruction in the Yucatan as well. Millions of people lose their life in this region just like they will in central Mexico. The major cities in the Yucatan region, the Yucatan Central American Maya zone, include Tikal, Caracol, Tulum. Chichen Itza is another one that is very famous with tourists. So, and then further south is an ancient military and agricultural complex of cultures in the Andean region. Mostly built around potato and quinoa farming, although there is also maize in this region. There is also a livestock economy with llamas and other domesticated animals, which are raised for textiles and also for food. These societies have been around for a really long time. About 2300, 2400 BCE is when we have some of the earliest recorded evidence of these societies. The earliest of these societies are responsible for building what are called the Nazca Lines, which you should look up because they are amazing and interesting, but also are built about 2,000 years before the period covered here. So I'm going to move on. By the 1300s and 1400s, the Andean societies have been unified under an empire, not unlike the Aztecs, led by a military leader. In this case, this empire is known as the Incan Empire, and they have built their capital around the cities of Cusco and the citadel of Machu Picchu. But there are other important urban centers in the area, not necessarily Incan, but under Incan control by the 1500s, like Tiwanaku and Chan Chan. The societies of the Andean are really fascinating because they have these complex irrigation systems so that they are able to farm arid regions. There's a lot going on in this history, and unfortunately, it's just something that we've scratched the surface on in terms of knowing much information about these communities. And of course, Native Americans today have some of this knowledge and may not necessarily be willing to share it with historians and anthropologists who are digging around their communities for a good story. So there's a lot going on, right? This slide kind of shows some of those complex features. I'm going to zone in on some of these specific areas just to talk about them in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to start with the south. I'm going to start with the Andes. So we'll go in the reverse order from the previous slide. When you look at the culture of the Andes, some things should kind of stand out as kind of common features to all of these cultures. These are sedentary settlements. They're permanent settlements that are connected by roads. There is evidence of agriculture in the Andean region dating from about 2800 BCE, before the Common Era. So, this, again, like Egypt times, right? These settlements were occupied until the consolidation of the Inca Empire, just before the arrival of the Spanish. And the Spanish basically built their cities on top of these Inca cities. Over time, these cultures developed different languages and different practices, different religious practices, but they're in some ways variations on themes. One of the things that they had in common were complex ceramic techniques and metallurgy, so glass and earthenware, and then also pretty skilled techniques with gold and bronze and silver and that kind of thing. There are some archaeologists who are definitely out of the mainstream, but they are convinced that there's evidence of trans-Pacific trade with Japanese or Chinese mariners. More than likely, there really is trade, but probably not with Japanese and Chinese mariners, but probably with Polynesians from some of the sort of nearby islands, right, thousands of miles away, like the Solomon Islands and the Easter Islands. At any rate, there's jade objects that are found. They could have also come from central Mexico. Regardless, there are a lot of goods in these Andean cities that are found from other parts of the Americas, which again suggests an extensive network of trade links even before the arrival of Europeans. Most Andean cultures are located in the arid highlands of the Andes or in the plains just below. These are not areas that are necessarily conducive to agriculture, but they have very good soil. And so Andean peoples figured out how to build aqueducts and other irrigation systems in order to bring water from higher areas into drier, lower areas. And they had crops like squash and beans and quinoa, and they raised livestock, including guinea pigs and llama. This is a very wealthy, very complex agricultural society. So the other thing that is characteristic of Andean cultures is weaving cloth and other textiles, using stone and shell objects, which form the basis of trade with other South American and Central American cultures. So one of the features of this kind of textile technique is a knotting practice known as quipu, which is kind of a record-keeping system or a writing that was used to record exchanges, censuses of population, tax assessment, So these are like receipts. These quipu exist today, and I think there's an image of one in one of the later slides that I'll include. So, Andean peoples also had complex social divisions and hierarchies with aristocratic classes, priestly classes, military castes that dominated ordinary peoples in the Andean regions. And they also had pretty fantastic architecture. They built these massive stone cities in the Andean mountains. And when the Spanish arrived, they were in awe of the culture that was built there. This is an image of roads built in the uh, 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 period of about 2800 to 1600 BCE in the Norte Chico or Caral culture. Sometimes this is referred to as the cradle of American civilization. It's where some of the earliest domesticated crops are found and the first established trading routes. We don't have a whole lot of information except for some, stones and other artifacts that have been dug up. This is a stone aqueduct. So you can kind of see it's a canal that's designed to bring water from highland areas into lowland areas. So this is in Peru, and it was constructed around 1000 BCE, so it's about 3000 years old. These skulls are a characteristic of some practices in Andean regions, and also kind of indigenous to the Americas. It's evidence of social hierarchies because these skulls are not found everywhere. But there are skulls that show a lot of care has been taken, a lot of ritual, which suggests high status associated with these high skulls. It's created through binding. Later, archaeologists, conspiracy theorists, the Indiana Jones movie, all kind of posit that these are alien skulls. They are not. They are created through totally human processes. But again, one of the things that the elongated skull kind of represents is this complex social division. So you could think about it as like, similar to ear piercing or lip stretching or any other tattooing, any other form of body modification that exists. This is another marvel of Andean culture. These are the Nazca lines or the Nazca traces, which were constructed between about 100 BCE and 800 CE. These lines are not really visible from the ground, and in fact, they're only partially visible from nearby mountains. They are constructed using very complex astronomical observations. They all align with something. I am not a scientist, but there are some very interesting science papers about what the Nazca lines indicate about the astronomical knowledge of the people that built them. They were when they were first observed, the Spanish just thought they were roads, but there are a number of these, enormous images. They're like the size of football fields. You can see them from space in the foothills of the Andes, the sort of salt plain foothills of the Andes. And they're very old. They were constructed with, basically a long, very heavy wooden or metal till, and it would have been pulled through the soil to create these lines. It would have been painstaking. It would have taken a lot of calculation more than anything else. So that has also led a lot of conspiracy theory minded people to suggest that aliens constructed this. That they're like alien or alien runways for spaceships, kind of thing. There's something that strikes me as like kind of racist about these ideas that Native Americans couldn't have done this without extraterrestrial help. So I always, when I, it's always, it's usually like white sci-fi fan who's really interested in this idea that maybe Native American cultures learned all of their neat tricks from aliens. There's something that's kind of insidiously colonial about that viewpoint. So it's also, it's something to think about when we kind of confront our own attitudes about the past. These are some other features that come to us from around the time that the Nazca lines were constructed. These are also from pre-Inca Andean societies. We don't know a whole lot about them or what their belief systems are, but we have these amazing artifacts from their culture. These are in the lower right-hand corner. That's a pipe. In the upper right hand is a figure of a woman, and it's probably a fertility symbol. And then next to those is a burial site, and the burial site was also kind of unusual because the bones underneath the mound are all kind of disorganized or dismembered. So, again, just a little bit more archaeological evidence, a little bit more visual to give you a sense of some of the complex features of these cultures. We're now getting a little bit closer to the Incas, at least in terms of chronology. These artifacts and these images come to us from Chimu culture, which is an Andean culture that is characterized by this kind of honeycomb building structure. One of the things that you can see next to it is some examples of Andean craftspersonship, I should say, because I'm sure women also contributed to this craft construction. In the right-hand corner, you can see a gold image of, it looks like the bird god or one of the bird gods. And then below that is a pipe that shows two figures fornicating. This is a culture that also embraces some aspect of sexuality in some sense. These artifacts are produced in the centuries just before the Inca came to power. This is an example of the quipu, which I was referring to earlier. Quipu is, these little knots. I don't know if you can see them. This is not the best image, but these little knots convey a lot of information. They convey information about people, information about objects and taxes. In some ways, when we look at this, we are looking at some kind of writing system. It is a complex communication system that allows for long-term relationships. And so as a result, when you look at Andean society, we're looking at a pretty complex economic society. There's a lot of accounting going on in these quipu. At any rate, this is an image of what one of those looks like. And then finally, we get to the Inca Empire about 1460. In some ways, the Inca are really kind of latecomers, right? They establish their empire just 4 or 5 decades before the arrival of the Spanish. The Spanish would really show up and start to screw things up for the Inca in the 1530s. So we're not talking about an empire that's very long lived. And in some ways, the Inca Empire is very similar to the Aztec Empire in that you have a region that is very old, that has many different ethnic groups, that has a very complex economy, and all of a sudden you have this group of people that are very militaristic, who are lining up behind a single leader, and they're trying to consolidate the entire region under centralized control. In central Mexico, it was the Aztecs, or the Mexicas, they're also known, and they create their capital at Tenochtitlan, and they demand tribute from neighboring communities. In some ways, the Inca are like that as well, but the Inca doesn't really describe a distinct ethnic group so much as they describe the followers of the Sapa Inca, which is like kind of a supreme leader or a military commander of a region. So the Sapa Inca kind of consolidates power around the capital of Cusco in 1460. And the Inca build a number of fortifications around the city. The Inca are responsible for the construction of what is probably the most famous, or one of the most famous pre-Columbian sites, and that is Machu Picchu. It's located in the Andes, so kind of up from Cusco a few hundred miles. Machu Picchu is this incredible site that's built way, way, way high. And you can see some of those images. This is not the best view, so you should look at some images online. You can't visit it anymore, I understand, because it's actually falling off the mountain due to tourism. But these, you can kind of see the ruins in these rows. They would have had roofs, they would have had coverings on the top, and so what we're looking at are really ruins. Machu Picchu is also not a terribly old site. It was built by the Inca just a few hundred years before the Spanish arrived, kind of thing. Or they started building it. I don't even know if it was complete by the time the Spanish arrived. This is kind of an example of Inca architecture at its height. This gives you another perspective of what Machu Picchu would have looked like, or not what it would have looked like, what it looks like today. Those are people in contemporary society walking around. You can see how little they are compared to the structures around them. The previous picture really does not do Machu Picchu justice. The two best known cultures in the Central America, Mexico region are the Maya and the Aztec. So I want to think about some of the characteristics that make these cultures similar, or some of the things they have in common in terms of historical development, because they do both descend in some form or fashion from Olmec culture, at least the influence of the Olmec. So some of the things that they have in common are the hero twins, which are represented as creators of cities and cultures. Jaguar and feathered serpent gods are also significant features in Maya and Aztec technology. Human sacrifice is also a feature of these religions. And for the Aztecs in particular, human sacrifice is fueled by warfare and taking captives from neighboring societies. While Mayas also engage in human sacrifice and warfare and raiding, it's certainly not as extensive as the Aztecs. This region is sometimes referred to as Mesoamerica. Mesoamerican societies also have sacred, ritualized, and competitive ball games. It's a large rubber ball that comes up about to your knee, and then you kind of throw it through a hoop. And you compete by bouncing it off your hips and your body. So it's kind of like a combination of basketball and soccer. You can see images of it online. You can Google it or YouTube it. It looks like a very difficult game. Interestingly enough, there are similarities of this game in North American sites, but instead of a ball in a hoop, it is a spear in a hoop. And these are cosmological symbols, or they are supposed to represent cosmological entities. At any rate, one of the elements, at least of the sort of traditional classical Mesoamerican game, is that at the end, the players are sacrificed, and it's not always clear whether it's the winning players or the losing players. Sacrifice may have been seen as a great honor or as a way to become a god or become deified. We don't really know. At any rate, most of these civilizations are sort of at a halfway point between South America, North America, and the Caribbean. And so you find items from all of these regions there. In some ways, the richness of this culture may have resulted from its geographic location at the crossroads of all of these different cultural and economic regions. In Aztec and Mayan sites, we find a lot of jade and stone carvings, pottery, textiles. So there's a lot of manufacturing in this culture. And ultimately, it's a culture, that is organized around agriculture, mostly maize, but also other crops. At any rate, Mesoamerican culture is mostly centered around the Valley of Mexico, which is the location of Tenochtitlan, which is now the ruins on top of which are now Mexico City. These cultures are usually built around major cities with pyramids, stone platforms that all have astronomical and cosmological significance. And typically, these empires are administered by, in Mayan city states, it's sort of the local regional powers. In central Mexico, it's usually a city that outranks the others. So the most recent of these cities is Tenochtitlan, but at different times in the history of central Mexico, that dominant region could have been Teotihuacan or one of the other large cities around. So, at any rate, these kind of religious, economic, cultural ties are very characteristic of the region. One of the reasons that we know about a lot of this culture is because the Mayans are a literate culture. They have a writing that preserves ideas. And luckily for us, they hid this stuff. They hid it because the Spanish were destroying their books. They were throwing them onto bonfires when they arrived. So the fact that we know about this culture at all is a little bit of a miracle. This is just an example of Mayan writing. So you can kind of see the script there. Um, there's a lot of pictographs, but also a lot of little kind of squiggly images that indicate different meanings, different aspects of language. This object is very old. It's older than either the Maya or Aztec societies. It is an artifact of Olmec culture. So it's produced anywhere from about 1500 to 400 BCE. One of the things that you might notice from the previous page is that the lines, the kind of technique of drawing is very similar to Maya writing. So, this artistic style that's really kind of invented by the Olmec ends up becoming the classical characteristic or classical cultural characteristic of Central Mexico, Central America. So the other thing that is associated with the Olmecs, which you might have seen at a museum, because American museums have a lot of these, are gigantic heads, these enormous statues of heads. So, and again, Olmecs gave us the cosmology of the feathered serpent, the twin gods. They give us the sacred ball game, which in North America will become the sacred hoop game. So we are looking at really kind of a foundational culture here. Sometime between the Olmecs and the Mayas, the Zapotec culture becomes dominant in Central America. Sorry, not Central America, Central Mexico. This is the Monte Alban site in central Mexico. And we don't know a whole lot about the Zapotecs either, except that many of their cities feature these pyramid structures. And so you can see that pyramid in the background. It's similar to the earthen pyramids in North America, which we'll also take a look at in a minute. And it's also similar to the pyramids in Teotihuacan and in Tenochtitlan, but these are very old. These are much, much older than the pyramids that are built in some of those more recent sites. You can see these platforms. The platforms would have had buildings on them. This is really there. Some of these buildings are self-contained, but on almost all of them, there are wooden structures and thatched structures that are kind of built superimposed on this. So we're really looking at the foundations of a city as opposed to a city itself. It's kind of like when we looked at that image of Machu Picchu, like the top of everything is kind of eroded or been blown off or disintegrated because it's not the same kind of material as the stone underneath. The Mayan zone is probably where we'll see, really the kind of hallmarks of European civilization much more dramatically than almost anywhere else in the Americas. The Mayas lived mostly on the Yucatan Peninsula. They seem to have descended from Olmec culture, although there's some physical distance from the cultures of central Mexico. There's like a pretty a rugged mountain range that separates much of the Yucatan Peninsula from the rest of Mexico. And as a result, these cultures are relatively self contained. They are more or less protected from invasions from other regions, although that does not mean they are protected from one another. But this region also does not seem to have a whole lot of conflict or civil war. The societies that were established in the region seem to be primarily trading societies. One of the last cities built in the Mayan sphere of influence is a port city called Tulum, which is still a port city. And this region also maintained more independence from European colonialism because it was more difficult to get into. The terrain is a lot more rugged. There's a lot of marshlands and there's jungle. And so if you don't know your way around, and the Spanish definitely didn't, it's a lot more difficult to bring people to heal. Also, these cities are connected by roads, but the roads had overgrown in a lot of cases with jungle. A lot of the cities were abandoned, or maybe the Maya only lived there part of the year. Whatever the case, we do know that the Maya, more than other Native American groups, kind of had the Spanish figured out. They knew that they were up to no good. They were hiding out from the beginning. And probably that's because the Spanish showed up in the Maya zone a little bit later than they show up to the Aztec region, or for that matter, the Caribbean. And the Yucatan is doing a trade with both central Mexico and the Caribbean. So the Mayans know who the Spanish are, right? When they show up, they don't think that they are fantastic creatures from overseas. They don't think that they may symbolize the coming of the feathered serpent god, which the Aztecs confuse, or some Aztecs rather confuse the Spanish for. And so as a result, there's a lot more resistance in the Yucatan. As a result, Mayan language is still widely spoken. Mayan culture is in some ways unbroken, although it has been under siege. Because a lot of traditions have been kept alive more or less surreptitiously in caves and cenotes and that kind of thing. But one of the things you might notice is just how many cities there are, right? And how packed they are toward one another. So, and then a little bit north, you can see kind of where Tenochtitlan and Teotihuacan is. This map has Mexico City, but that's Tenochtitlan. This is a text from Popol Vuh, which is one of the Mayan books. There's another book called the Chilam Balam. These books contain knowledge of the Mayan religion, but they also have lots of information about crop cycles, astronomy, mathematics, civil engineering. These, are kind of complicated books. We don't have all of them. We don't actually have a lot of them because when the Spanish found them, they destroyed them. Many of them come to us because they were preserved secretly in caves. But you have to imagine, caves are not the best place to preserve material, particularly when they flood out, which caves in the Yucatan do. So it's a little bit of a miracle that this artifact still lives, that people can still kind of see some of those connections to the past. So at any rate, I said earlier that the Mayan language is still spoken. It's not connected to Mayan writing, and so a lot of guesswork sort of has to be done in connecting those. And modern Mayan language is not necessarily the same as it was, 600 years ago because languages evolved, right? At any rate, this is just a picture of the manuscript that I think is really beautiful and illuminating and shows some of the handiwork of Mayan culture. It's also interesting to me because these are big books. They are not just keeping taxes. They are not just recording basic data. They are now starting to communicate very complex ideas. This is an image of a man playing the sacred ball game that I referred to earlier, which the Mayans referred to as Poktatok. And this is some classic architecture from the height of Maya power. When you look at the Maya cities that are built between 250 and 900 CE, you find that there are these enormous pyramids, very complex urban structures with large and small buildings, and kind of a complex city plan. You can see what looks like a kind of a tower, and I believe this is Tikal, but I was foolish and I did not document my notes. So let this be a lesson to you to always take notes in real time and not just when you have to go back and review and check. So anyway, you can kind of Google search it. I don't know if it's Chichen Itza or Tikal or Tulum. Look it up, right? But it is definitely from the Maya classic era. And this is definitely Tikal. This shows the main pyramid, and you can see all those people at the bottom. So these are very, very large structures. This is the Temple of the Warriors. You can see those images in the foreground, those column-like images. And this is the pyramid in the city of Kukulkan. And earlier I did not clarify, the Temple of the Warriors is at Tikal. So I think you can connect the dots on the map if you reverse back a couple of slides. Now we come to the Aztec zone, which is really centered on Lake Texcoco. Tenochtitlan is built on Lake Texcoco, but so are the nearby cities of Tlacopan, Tula, and Teotihuacan. Previous to the ascendancy of the Aztecs as kind of the leading power in the region, Teotihuacan had been a major center of power, and it seems like there is a military complex center there around 1000 CE. It is estimated that at its height, 100,000 people or more lived in Teotihuacan, which has the largest surviving pyramids. But these other cities around Lake Texcoco are also major cities as well. Almost all of them, including Tenochtitlan, had some kind of urban settlement or site before the arrival of the Aztecs. The Aztecs are really kind of latecomers. They call themselves Mexica, and at first, when they show up in the region, they offer themselves as almost like mercenaries for the local rulers. But in the 1300s, they take over, they establish their own aristocratic hierarchy, and they consolidate control of the region through military conquest. And it seems like one of the purposes for that military conquest was to sacrifice greater and greater numbers of people to their gods. And the Aztecs have one god in particular, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god, which is very thirsty for human blood. And so as a result, by the time the Spanish show up in 1520, 1519, 1520, the Aztecs have not made themselves very well liked in the region. So it's one reason why they are able to be defeated very quickly despite having all of this power. So if you ask yourself, how did this happen so quickly? The answer is not because of Spanish superiority or skill or strategy. It's the fact that they happen to show up, and they have the very good luck that the societies they are visiting are filled with divisions that they can exploit. This is the city of Tula. Tula is, as you could see in the previous slide, kind of on the northern edge of Lake Texcoco. There's a massive pyramid there and a huge urban settlement. These cities are not, by the way, they are not very far away from each other, right? We are talking about a distance that's like New York to Philadelphia. So these regions are not just regions where there's one or two cities, there are many large cities. And this is the Great Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan was not founded by the Aztecs. It's much, much older than the Aztec Empire. We don't really know all of the information about its founding. Teotihuacano culture is kind of a militaristic culture, but they also have two of the largest pyramids in the Americas and the largest pyramids in the world outside of Egypt. And by volume, I think they're larger. I just don't think they're quite as tall. This is, I think, the Empire of the Moon. And so you can see the people loitering along this long avenue in the middle. This is a massive structure, and we are looking at the Empire of the Moon from the Empire of the Sun, which is an equally large pyramid that's located across this grand avenue. When you see these platforms, it looks very empty, but you have to really picture structures on top of it, right? These are foundations for cities as much as they are cities themselves. And this is the opposite view, just to give you an idea of how large this city is. And this is just the city center. This actually doesn't actually include any of the places where people live. So um, this is referred to as the Avenue of the Dead and the Temple of the Sun. So I want to just kind of reiterate this legend because I think it's kind of instructive and important. The Aztecs arrive in the region in about 1350. They speak a language called Nahuatl. It's related to the kind of regional language, the Nahua language. They supposedly originate from Aztlan, which is north of Mexico. We don't really know where, just north, although it has been speculated that Aztlan is New Mexico or Texas or Arizona, the southwest of the United States. It is actually very likely that they came from one of those Puebloan societies, and that they have moved. They may have moved because of pressure from a drought caused by the Little Ice Age. Whatever the case, they show up after wandering around the Great Chihuahuan Desert in the 13th or 14th century. It's already urbanized, it's already wealthy. There's already these rich agricultural fields of maize and amaranth and other crops. And the Aztecs essentially come in and they say, well, we'll be like your protectors, we'll be soldiers, we'll fight your wars for you, kind of thing. Because Tenochtitlanos are too busy in commerce and their own lives, kind of thing. Eventually, they are able to take it over. They rename the city. The name of the city before was not Tenochtitlan. They rename the city Tenochtitlan, and they immediately erect a shrine to Huitzilopochtli, which is the hummingbird god who the Aztecs kind of owe their success to. The Aztecs also use the word Mexica to refer to themselves. This is where Mexico comes from, the word Mexico, right? At any rate, their rituals are not very elaborate before they take power, but after they take power, Huitzilopochtli demands more and more and more blood. And it really kind of fuels this militaristic empire. And it's not clear if the Aztecs are using sacrifice as a pretense to wage war on their neighbors, or if they have to wage war on their neighbors because they need to satisfy their religion. Whatever the case is, they really irritated their neighbors. Their neighbors were very willing to join up with the Spanish whenever they showed up. So, at any rate, by the time of the arrival of the Spanish, Tenochtitlan is a massive city. It's at least 200,000, and maybe as many as 400,000. I've seen other more eccentric estimates that are much higher than that, but it seems like 200 to 400,000 is kind of a good consensus. It's built on top of the marshes of Lake Texcoco, and the city, you see this at the very, very beginning, but the city is built up of like these kind of movable bridges. If the Tenochtitlanos want to keep anybody out, they can kind of move these thatch or marshy bridges to create a little bit of a barrier, a little bit of self-protection. At any rate, they are in a very good position to dominate the region and are able to do so. And really, they're able to resist Spanish incursion for a long period of time. What ultimately does the Aztecs in is a disease. It's smallpox. It wipes out the city so that when the Spanish come back to retake it, it's very easy to basically decapitate the government. When we get into northern Mexico and the southwest United States, we see a culture that has some elements in common with Mesoamerican culture, and also some elements in common with Mississippian culture east of the Mississippi in North America. We're kind of where we are, right? Present day United States east of the Mississippi. At any rate, this culture is almost certainly derived from Mesoamerican culture. Maybe it was, maybe the region was settled by people who left Mesoamerica, or maybe those ideas simply came to the region. But whatever the case, if you look at the a sort of desert area between the Great Chihuahuan Desert in northern Mexico and the southern edge of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and New Mexico, you see these stone cities that are built mostly in the cliffs and some of the desert highlands. When they were built, the region was probably much wetter. It was definitely much wetter. We know it was from the soil record. And as early as the first millennia CE, you see pretty extensive agriculture built around maize, beans, and squash, which in most North American agricultural systems and belief systems are referred to as the Three Sisters. These crops work together. They are planted together, and they sort of aid each other. And the way that has been explained to me is that beans fix the nitrogen in the soil, so they keep it from getting stripped down. Corn is obviously the sort of most important crop, and then the squash lays across the corn and acts as a kind of pesticide. I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I have no idea. But these crops do work together. They do grow together very well. I'm sure there's a more sophisticated biological answer for this, but I am not a biologist. Regardless, this agricultural system is wealthy enough that it's able to sustain a region of these stone cities. And you can still visit them today. When I was a kid, I grew up in Texas. We would drive out to Chaco Canyon or Mesa Verde and Cañón de Chelly and look at some of these sites. So I actually have lots of memories of some of the photos that I'm going to show shortly. Southwest cultures used a lot of native grasses, and there's a lot of basket weaving and textile production. There's also the use of clay for pottery and also for home building. These all serve as really important trading commodities. You also see shells and polished beads, which in North America are used as a kind of currency. They are, kind of a sacred currency. They have spiritual value, but they also have economic value and can be used as modes of exchange as well. For most of its history, it seems like these cultures lived seasonally in cities, and they abandoned them once and for all around 1000 CE. So the very last people to live in these cities seem to abandon them in the 1200s or the 1300s, just before the Little Ice Age. The Southwest deities are primarily animal and astronomical deities. There is also an emphasis in Southwest cultures on the trickster god, notably a god associated with the coyote. And the coyote is someone who is kind of arbitrary and cruel, much like the climate of the Southwest. And when you look at this culture as agricultural site, or not agricultural sites, archaeological sites, you notice there are periods where there's lots of dense, continuous occupation, and then there are long periods of abandonment. So people kind of go away and they return. One of the things that we know from looking at these sites is that there is a lot of social complexity. So like the cultures of Mexico or the Maya or South America, there's an upper class and a lower class and a priestly class. So all of these sort of elements that are associated with civilization, again, are present in these Southwestern societies. So you can see how they are mapped in the panel, the southwestern societies are referred to as Anasazi, which is what we know most about because their sites are the best preserved. Their sites are Chico Canyon, Cañón de Chelly, and Mesa Verde. And south of that, you have the Mogollon. Cities are built as far south as northern Mexico, and you can visit some of these places as well. They are really spectacular. Paquime is in particular well preserved, as is Cuarenta Casas. You can see that they have built the foundations for these thatched structures and wooden structures that go on top of them. And these are the ruins at Mesa Verde in southern Colorado. This is the Gila Cliff Dwelling site in the Mogollon region. Now what's interesting about this is a very small site compared to some of the others. Our other important cultural and economic zone in North America is located primarily to the east of the Mississippi River, although you see some activity in East Texas and Oklahoma. You'll notice there's a big gap geographically between the Southwest cultures and the Mississippian cultures. And so, what's between? Well, there are not a ton of links, but we have found objects in both sites. And so, we know that people are passing across this region. The region in between is grasslands and plains. It's the Great Plains, and the peoples that live there are mostly nomadic peoples that follow the buffalo and other animals in the region. There is a lot of trading that goes back and forth between these regions, but you're not going to see cities and towns between New Mexico and the Mississippi region. So the Mississippi zone really kind of comes into like its sort of full extent between about 1000 and 1300 CE, the current era, so about 1,000 years ago or so. And then it begins to decline between 1300 and 1400. And this is precipitated by a very serious drought, which we have lots of ecological evidence of. So there's not really that much of a mystery as to why Mississippians abandon these sites. But you can see how far away they are. And basically, they're taking ideas from one place and they're taking them to another. You have a similar agricultural system to the Southwest United States. You have the Three Sisters. Mississippian people also cultivated sunflower, barley, berries. And again, they kind of create a sort of permaculture. There's also extensive deer and wild game hunting. Mississippians also use grasses and plant fibers to make textiles. Their culture is really centered on the exchange of sacred beads, pottery, and metalworking, especially copper. And so you have a fairly rich material culture. Something about these beads, just because it's something people know a little bit about in U.S. history, partly because of this, idea that the Dutch traded the island of Manhattan for, a trunk full of beads kind of thing. These beads are very labor intensive to produce. They are made of materials that are sometimes difficult to polish. And so they represent objects of great value. If you look at some of the bead belts or wampum belts as they're known, they're not very big. They may only be a few feet long, but they took years to make. And so they acquire value. They have sacred value, but they also acquire economic value and can be used as exchange. So it's a pretty complex economic trading network that exists basically throughout the eastern half of the United States. There is mound building, and because of the mound building and because of how closely they resemble the pyramids in central Mexico, it's assumed that the influences are the same. There are some similar gods. There is also a winged serpent god in some places, or a birdman god that is similar to the winged serpent of central Mexico. There's also a hoop game, but instead of a hoop and a ball, it's a hoop and a spear. And they also have another game called Chunky, which is eventually going to develop in or sorry, the hoop game is called Chunky. Chunky eventually will evolve into lacrosse. So, the spear with the hoop turns into a stick with a net. At any rate, a lot of archaeologists, a lot of anthropologists suggest connections between these ancient ball games. At any rate, there's a lot of similarities between these cultures. The final element is that religious worship centers on the North Star and the Morning Star, as well as some other astronomical deities. There is also human sacrifice, at least in some sites in Mississippian culture, although it does not seem as central as it does in Mesoamerican culture. The best preserved of these sites is right outside of St. Louis at a site called Cahokia. The Cahokia Mounds were initially thought by Europeans to be mountains. Native Americans had always seen them as sacred sites and used them as sacred sites. And so there's some indication that Native Americans always knew what they were and knew what they were for before they were abandoned. This is like a kind of an oral tradition about the site. Because of famine, because of ecological pressure, Cahokia is abandoned between about 1200 and 1400 CE. And the mounds overgrow, and the buildings, the non-mound buildings are all made out of wood and thatch. They're all kind of destroyed. Some of them are preserved in the soil. We have a little bit of it in the fossil record, but most of Cahokia is wiped out. Again, Cahokia is the best preserved of these sites. So if you look at some of these other sites, you might see the mounds, but the archaeological evidence may not be quite as extensive as it is in Cahokia. Archaeologists at Cahokia have found objects from all over the Americas, which suggests that Mississippian culture is part of an intricate trade network. And the other thing they found at Cahokia is a lot of bodies, and a lot of bodies that were of people who were killed with their hands bound. So it seems like there is also extensive human sacrifice in Cahokia as well. And who knows what kinds of characteristics they may have shared with Mesoamericans, because a lot of that evidence was destroyed by Europeans. A lot of it was just kind of lost to us because of time. This is an artist's rendering of what Cahokia might have looked like based on the archaeological evidence. As you can see, it's massive. It's huge, and there seems to be a lot of similarities, at least superficially, to some of those Aztec structures and Maya structures that we looked at earlier. We don't really know how many people lived in Cahokia or how permanent the population was, because it was a ritual site. Pilgrims probably came in, so there's probably a transient population. The permanent population is estimated to be anywhere from 30 to 50,000 people. And that does not sound like a lot in 2020, but that's a lot of people. That's larger than almost any comparable city in Europe, except for maybe two or three, right? Like Paris, Rome, and London. So, and maybe like a couple of the cities from the Low Countries, like Belgium and the Netherlands and that kind of thing. But when we talk about 30 to 50, 30 to 60,000 people in the year 1300, we are talking about a massive megalopolis, right? A regional power. Cahokia wasn't even the largest. Cahokia is just the best preserved. The largest city in Mississippian culture is probably a Poverty Point, about 300 or 400 miles south in Louisiana. These objects are from the Etowah site, which is in Georgia. Etowah is another Mississippian culture, or another Mississippian city, but it's very far away. It's hundreds of miles to the east. And so one of the things that we know about Mississippian culture is that it was very extensive. And these designs are similar to designs found throughout North America. So on the figure on the left is the bird god, which is kind of characteristic of Mississippian deities. And then these other figures are pipes. I don't know if you can see the hole. That's in the sort of the figure that looks like it's drinking from a bowl. And actually, I don't think that that's what that is supposed to symbolize. Knowing about the sort of sexual signification of uh, um, the sort of cultures of the time, and particularly the Southwest cultures and the Kokopili, if you know the significance of that, it may actually be a fertility object, and so that may have some kind of sexual indication. The final region or zone of influence is the Caribbean, and the Caribbean is the actually the first group of people to encounter Europeans. The cities are not as densely packed or densely populated. City is probably not the right word for Caribbean settlements. They're more like villages. But there are semi permanent as well as nomadic peoples living in the Caribbean. The Arawaks and the Taino are very good sailors. And so the Caribbean region is filled with goods that are coming from all over the Americas. It is a culture that is also based on agriculture. There's maize, but also cassava. And there is some hunting and gathering as well. There's a lot of fishing and a lot of shell fishing. The religion emphasized ancestor worship, hallucinogenic like herbs, and fertility rites. There's evidence of a ball game, and there are ball courts that have been found in archaeological sites in the Caribbean. And so we know that there's some influence from a Mesoamerican culture. The ball game is called bate. And then finally, there is very good boat technology. If you can sail from, and the Caribbean is nice sometimes, and then sometimes it's choppy and there are hurricanes, right? So if you can sail from one end of this body of water to the other, you were quite accomplished. And we have lots of evidence that the Arawakan and Taino peoples of the region did just that. We find objects from all over the Americas in the Caribbean, and of course they would have had to figure out how to get there by some means anyway. So, at any rate, we probably know the least about this culture as well because they were the first to encounter the Spanish. The Spanish were the most brutal in the Caribbean. In some places, they completely wiped out the local islands' population, or they rounded up all the indigenous people on some of the islands and they shipped them into the mines of Mexico. Basically, they sold them into slavery. And as a result, the societies there and the cultures there were destroyed much more rapidly than they were other places. They all, I mean, you have to imagine also, like, they've never heard of these people before. Why would you expect strangers to not be friendly, especially if they're not starting out killing you? So there's a lot more trust in the Spanish. Even by the time they show up to Mexico City, the Aztecs know who they are. So they are a known entity. Everywhere else they show up, or everywhere else Europeans show up, Native Americans are like, yeah, we've heard of you. That is not the case with the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, Native American peoples are really kind of caught off guard. And it's not totally clear at first that the Spanish have these kind of evil designs. I'm not supposed to use terms like good and evil in history, but it's hard not to look at colonialism and evaluate it as pretty damned evil. So at any rate, there's a lot of kind of complexities that go into this history, and so as a result, we really don't know as much as we know about some of these other cultures. And just kind of wrapping up, we might think about how it is we know what we know about Colombian society, how it challenges our assumptions, but also how it challenged some of the assumptions of the Europeans who showed up in the 1500s and 1600s. And ultimately, many Europeans, and in fact, a couple of people that we're reading this week, including Michel de Montaigne in the essay on cannibals, will draw attention to the ways in which these supposedly savage societies are really much more civilized than European society, and that Europe and colonialism is where the real savagery is. The fact that Europeans are saying this as early as the 16th century, in the 1500s, within 100 years of Columbus's so-called discovery, means that they did know what they were doing was wrong. There is some kind of moral accounting for the consequences of their actions, and they do realize that, at least to some extent, that their actions are leading to the genocide and destruction of a people. I won't talk as much about Native American cultures after this. And after this point, Native American cultures are really very radically transformed by the arrival of Europeans, and particularly by Christianity more than anything else. So this is a prequel, right? But to quote William Faulkner and everybody else who uses this phrase, past is prologue. This is a kind of the story that frames what will happen after the arrival of Columbus and Vespucci and all of these other guys.